Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
All right. Welcome back again to another podcast episode. We are now in chapter 2. We somewhat completed chapter 1 last week, so it's a good transition into the beginning of chapter 2. So Varangi, do you want to go ahead and give some sort of summary of where we stand?
Yeah. And so, like Kim said, we went through the first chapter, which really just showed that Arjuna is in the middle of a battlefield and in the middle of a war. And naturally, the war has two sides. Arjuna is on one of those sides. He takes a moment to realize that he's fighting against family members, against relatives. And he's shaken by that truth, by that reality. At that moment, he's pondering about the nature of family, karma, sin, dharma, like what is the right thing to do. And he decides that it's just not worth it to fight. He also, at some point, checks out. And this is at the beginning of the second chapter, where he's now telling Krishna that he's not going to fight, that he's just sitting down, and he actually let go of his bow and arrows. Shortly after that, he takes, or actually a little bit before he actually physically checks out, he takes shelter of Krishna, and he's looking to him as his teacher, with the hope that Krishna can lead him and can give him some solace and direction and guidance. And that's really where we stand now, I guess before last night's class. And then once verse 8 rolls around, that's when Krishna starts answering Arjuna, and not really directly to what all the arguments that Arjuna posed, but really starting from ground zero. Like, okay, everything you're saying makes sense and all that, but we can't go to D without understanding A. And I think that's where we started last night.
All right, thank you. It's a really nice summary. Yeah, it was interesting how Tukaram Prabhu pointed out that, okay, now Arjuna's finally, last week we got to the point where Arjuna reached this point of submission. And this is now the first time that Krishna is kind of giving his wisdom, his actual advice. And I thought it was telling that the first thing he went into was like the soul and the body. And these are very basic concepts of all spirituality and religious movements, religious organizations. And so I think it's great that we're getting into the soul, the body, is it eternal, consciousness right away. Today, I think you had something you wanted to note about atheism or the soul in general?
Yes. So verse 211, Krishna starts arguing with Arjuna for the first time, right? And it's essentially Krishna's first argumentation on Gita, which he says, while speaking learned words, you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Those who are wise lament neither for the living nor for the dead. So what is Krishna saying here, right? That you spoke very nicely, Arjun, but you are lamenting for those who are about to die. That's essentially where all your troubles are coming from, and they happen to be your family members. So it's definitely a reasonable lamentation. The very next verse, which goes hand in hand, Krishna says, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings who are in front of them for the battle, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. Now, in philosophy, it's known that when you make a point, you back it up, right? So Krishna just made a point, hey, you're lamenting for what's not worthy. So now he's backing that up by stating that you're lamenting for those who are about to die. But guess what? We never die because we are not these bodies. We are eternal spiritual souls. That's why he says, there's never a time where I didn't exist, nor you, nor all these kings, neither in the future shall any of us cease to be. So Krishna is essentially telling Arjuna here, you don't even know who you are, right? You were thinking you were this body, you're lamenting for all of it, but we are eternal souls. And so, yeah, we get the first glimpse of what it means to be a soul. We are eternal, and therefore we never die. And the way I related this to atheism, Kim, was that I was listening to a debate between two gentlemen, one named Jordan Peterson, who was on the theist side, and the other was Sam Harris, who is in the atheist side. And actually, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and two other, they were actually prominent scientists nowadays who are strong atheists, and they have a really big following. A lot of people follow these guys based on their discrimination of theology. However, they're mainly talking about Western theology, not really Eastern theology. And Sam Harris pointed out that there is a point between religions that are not cohesive, that they don't follow, they're not congruent with each other, and thus criticizing theology in general, which is the problem of evil. So that in the Western conception of evil is that the devil actually exists, and it is a force where all bad things come from. And God is kind of there in a box match against the devil. Whereas in Eastern thoughts, we don't attribute existence to a being, to like evil, to like an evil demon that exists, to a devil that exists. Instead, we understand that malevolence comes from our own ignorance, but that by nature, the soul is pure. And it is only ignorance that causes the soul to act in a weird way, which then causes all this suffering that seems to be coming from a source of evil, but is that source is our own ignorance. So again, to relate this to atheism is that these so-called scientists, atheist scientists, they are discriminating and in one sense ridiculing religion. But just like Arjuna, obviously Arjuna was on a much, much higher level than them, but just like Arjuna, these so-called atheist scientists don't even know who they are because they can't explain the nature of their soul, which is who they are. Like Krishna just said here, we're not these bodies, we live forever. And these scientists are really thinking, I'm this body, I'm my intelligence, I am my mind, but they are wrong about the nature of their own selves. So why should they be credited for their attempts to define God if they don't know even who they themselves are? How much credits should they have when they're attempting to define God? So the way I'm relating this to atheism is that there's this notion where religion is bad. Religion carries a bad connotation nowadays. And matter of fact is that some religions don't postulate a really cohesive theology. They simply don't. It's something that Tukaram explained yesterday. If the very premise of our theological understanding is that we are bad by nature, then when we touch something which is divine, that something is going to be changed to something less than ideal, to something that is no longer divine. And by our inherent bad nature, we're going to change something that is divine to something that is degraded. But this is Western religion system. In our Eastern religion system, we are eternally good. The spirit soul is eternally pure. It is currently only that we find ourselves in ignorance and acting in a weird way. But by following the spiritual practices that we have, we are able to get back to our pure states of existence, thus postulating a theological concept which is much more philosophical, much more rational, that is not subject to these flaws in understanding. So this atheist so-called scientists, they have a very easy time debating some of these Western theologians, so-called theologians. I wish some of our teachers had the opportunity to debate them as well. So yes, atheism, most of them don't even know who they are. And they are postulating the possibility that God doesn't exist. Why do we even listen to them? They should be discredited from the beginning. If you cannot explain consciousness, who, if anything, is who you are, then why are you even attempting to define the supreme consciousness? And a glimpse of that is given to us here in Bhagavad Gita. Krishna is telling Arjuna, who is much more qualified than any of these so-called atheist scientists of today. Krishna is even telling Arjuna, hey, you are missing the point. You are not this body who is going to die. You are actually a spirit soul. And I mentioned in the previous class, something that I really appreciate about Gita, one of innumerable, infinite things about Gita that I so much appreciate, is that it takes us to the journey, right? This is chapter 2, and we are being introduced to this early on concepts of spirituality. Number 1, we are not the body, we are spiritual souls. And that's the classical distinction between matter and spirit. Body is matter, soul is a spirit. We are not body, we are souls. So yes, that's what I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, when I grew up, we were always taught about the soul from the beginning. So to me, coming into this tradition, it's like, oh yeah, the soul, I get it, it's eternal. But when I grew up, it was that when you were born, your soul is inherently evil. It was because of original sin, Adam and Eve. And so to come to a tradition like this, where we believe that the soul is good, ultimately, is really game-changing. And I thought it was interesting how Tukaram Prabhu in last night's lecture also talked about how important it is for reasons that you just mentioned today, about believing that the soul is pure and how that relates to us surrendering to a guru. And he had a really good quote about that the idea that a human touch automatically obfuscates the message of God is based on the premise that we're fundamentally flawed human beings. And that if we're fundamentally pure souls, then having a group of elders between us and God doesn't provide any obstacles, because since they're pure souls, then they can be transparent mediums for us. They can pass on stuff to us. And so, I mean, the idea that souls are inherently good has a lot of ramifications as far as spiritual growth is concerned. And so I also thought it was really interesting where he said that the key to unlocking the secrets of the Gita was that Arjuna, he found a teacher, he found a tribe, and then he humbled himself. So that humility, being receptive to it, I thought it was really key.
That's right. And then also to scrutinize arguments from atheists is that you are ridiculing Western traditions by saying that, well, Adam and Eve committed the original sin, and then we are all bad, inherently bad now. And Eastern traditions doesn't even consider that point, because we know that we are all pure. It's like, no, let's scrutinize it. Let's see, does it live up to the judgment of even our moral ethics now in the law of men? If your parents, or let's say your grandparents, to be even more prominent with this example, if your grandparent stole a bank are the cops going to come and arrest you, the granddaughter? Well, that's ridiculous. Even in the law of man nowadays, nobody would believe that. We would laugh at that possibility. You wouldn't be thrown in prison because of something that your grandparents did. So that's what I was, going over, that it's quite easy to pick on certain theological thoughts that, yeah, some of them are not as philosophical. That's just a fact. It's not comparing or pointing fingers and diminishing them. It's just pointing out some things are not as good as others. And the idea that Adam and Eve, thousands and thousands of years ago, committed the original sin, and because of that, we are all bad now, inherently bad. Well, do we really believe that? Does it really make sense? Rationally, philosophically, does it hold water? It does not. So, yes, we're not. We are pure souls. And like you mentioned, Quinn, that change in worldview, that change in our theological understanding makes for a guru to be something much more powerful now. Because like you mentioned, it is a transparent medium that can touch us, that can speak to us the same way that Krishna spoke to Arjuna. That's something else that Tukaram mentioned in class yesterday. I certainly had this thought. Well, Arjuna is so lucky. He's got Krishna right next to him and teaching him, telling him what to do. It is certain that if Krishna was to appear to me and tell me what to do, I would do it. I should think that way. But Krishna is not here telling me what to do. But yes, he is. Our gurus they are a pure representation of Krishna. And that is only possible through a theology which acknowledges the soul as being pure by nature. And our gurus have taken spiritual life serious enough where they were able to eradicate every inch of ignorance from their consciousness. And they're now a transparent medium of spiritual wisdom. So yes.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in at this point because you both have brought up really, well, this important aspect, very actually fundamental aspect of spirituality. And I'd like to backtrack a little bit, still within the realm of consciousness, and go over it the way that Tukaram has explained it, because it really transformed my understanding when it came to explaining it to other people. And I think this is one of the biggest lessons that I've been able to learn, is that spirituality is actually alive, right? Having a spiritual life or a practice means that we hear something, hopefully wisdom, something that's true, then we apply it into our lives and we make it our own, right? So we still are reaching up, getting help from our teachers, from people that are more advanced on this path, but then it's our responsibility to grow that seed, to keep it alive. We won't be able to explain it. So I'm going to do this exercise as in that way, I guess, with that perspective. So one thing that I really loved the way that Tukaram explains consciousness, is that, okay, and especially related to this verse 13 where Krishna is giving that evidence, like Sosa Prabhu brought up, he made a statement and now he's proving it. So he's giving evidence for why he thinks that we're not the body. And so he's talking about, as the embodied soul continuously passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, right? The transmigration of that soul. The soul similarly passes into another body after death. A sober person, a person that's situated in truth, a transcendentalist, is not bewildered by such a change because he understands who he is, right? And so going with this, and I know Tukaram touched this point last night specifically, he's saying, yes, for those of us that think that we are our mind and our thoughts, this is great evidence that there is actually an innate separation between the body and the soul. The soul being me, you, each one of us being spiritual beings, but we are inhabiting or living in a body, right? And that's the way that we can connect with this material world. And so that ability to observe our thoughts already means that we're not our thoughts. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to detach and observe. And this really points to the fact that consciousness is really the most basic symptom of being spiritual. And so he was explaining, and I'm not sure if this is something that he brought up specifically in, but the fact that we can think, relate to one another, all these things means that we're conscious. That animals are conscious, plants are conscious, right? That just means that we are souls having a material experience or a material body, right? We're not bodies that have souls, but we are souls that have bodies. And so the fact that we can interact in this way means that we're conscious. But also, it points to the fact that matter derives from consciousness, not the other way around, which really ties into a lot of the explanations from atheism, right? Well, consciousness is a result of all this interaction of chemicals, but it's never been proven that chemicals can think or feel and ration and use logic. And so we can conclude that matter is a derivative of consciousness. And furthermore, which is the part that really blew my mind, was how Tukram was explaining that the fact that we're all conscious really doesn't mean that the way in which we use that consciousness is valuable. And this is where I want to tie it into the last thing you said, Soza, which I thought was really important. So the fact that we're conscious beings and that we are pure fundamentally also doesn't sadly mean that we're going to use that consciousness, that mind, our bodies in such a way that will be helpful and will be used for self-realization. We hear a lot of people that can influence millions of people, and they're not necessarily leading them in the right direction, right? And so what makes, and this is something you answered, it was a question that I was going to pose, but you definitely answered it, was, well, how do we know that the people that we're following are actually on the path of truth? And is it enough that they're spiritual beings, and by being spiritual, they're automatically pure? And the answer is no, that's not enough, because the fact that we're conscious doesn't mean that we're using that consciousness in a valuable way or in the right way, per se. So I thought that was really interesting, because it really helps us maybe have a quick and an easy test to go through in life. You know, the way that somebody speaks, the way that they act, what we read, just books or things that we listen to. We can have this, I guess, yeah, a test to root out and weed out people that are really just not walking their talk. And so what really makes, for example, and it sounds a little like cliquey, like our teachers, you know, but I mean, we all agree that through all the traditions that we've looked into or that we've tried to practice, this is obviously the most attractive one for us, and that's why we're in it and we're practicing it. And so in that way, yeah, these Vaishnavas, these teachers that are helping and guiding people like us, you know, they're not only pure on a fundamental level, but also they have used that consciousness, they have used that body, that software, hardware, I guess the body could be thought of as hardware, to really realize and understand who they are, which really ties into your initial point, that if you don't know who you are, how can you know anything else? It's a must starting point. And so what makes a guru a guru is somebody that knows who they are and knows where they came from and where to go after realizing where we're at now. And so that really was something that helped me, because coming from a different background, mostly from the Western theology, it was really hard for me at some point to believe that, you know, certain books were actually true, or that how do I know that this isn't just made up by somebody that drank too much wine one night and just came up with this like epic story. Like now I'm like devoting my whole life to this, but it just like ended up, you know, being like an accident, and it's not really true. And so yeah, it actually makes sense that somebody that voluntarily chooses to seek truth, is humble, is receptive, will receive that mercy, that grace, because God is all good. And by putting himself or herself in that position of, by or through free will, they're using everything in that service, then yeah, they're going to be somebody that can uplift other people, that can make truth digestible to anybody, and that by their own example, their light, you know, is shining bright, and people are going to be attracted, and people are going to hear, and people are going to follow. And so I guess I just wanted to bring a little more light to these points, because it was something that really stood out to me at the beginning of my spiritual life, but even just going through it and hearing from other people, this is a big deal, and it's a big source of anxiety. Like, how do I know this path is the right one? How do I know that this teacher is actually a real teacher and it's not a charlatan that's trying to get something out of me? How do I know you guys are not like a cult that are trying to like brainwash people? And then, you know, we've seen it through history, people that abuse their power and their charisma. And so what makes this tradition different? And I think, you know, as we go through these podcasts, and we have already touched on a lot of these important points, this is what makes this tradition a very real, practical path. You know, it's like we hear the truth, for example, reading from the text, but then we have teachers that really connect it to our everyday life, and then we take that and then we ask ourselves, does that fit? Does that fit with my experiences? Does that fit with how I view the world? And if it doesn't, why? And if it does, then why? And how can I apply that? And then through that practice, then we could actually come to taste some of that fruit of realizing those teachings. And so anyway, I just wanted to bring up those points, that it wasn't, yeah, although consciousness is the most irreducible symptom of spirituality, being conscious is completely synonymous with being a spiritual being. That doesn't necessarily mean that every conscious being is using that consciousness for the right purposes. And so I know we can go on and on. I'll stop now, but I wanted to tie it into another point that Tikram brought up, which was how our lives can actually be a bunch of zeros, you know? And so we do so much, and we really get so caught up in like building a name for ourselves and a legacy and a family and blah, 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 blah. But then really, if we don't put that one in front of those zeros, one being divinity and like that knowledge of who we are, then nothing we do is actually meaningful. So I'll stop now, but I wanted to bring that up.
Those are all great points, Varangi. And the problem you posed, I'd like to address, which is, how do we know that this tradition is bona fide, that we're not just gonna drink the Kool-Aid, as people have said, right? I was thinking about this point. I was discussing it with my wife, and we had an interesting realization I'd like to share, which is that we are certainly attached to our bodies. We can do a mental exercise and realize we are not the bodies, but we are certainly attached to the body. And it is difficult for us to completely let go of the notion that I am not this body, right? That I am this body. And having had some introspective thoughts, you can, like Krishna is saying here, right? As the body passes from youth to old age and so on, if you continue in that thought experiments, we can see the body is changing. The body is constantly changing, but we, the observer, we remain there. So we are not the body because we remain the same, but the body changes. Now that can be done. It would require some effort, but it can be done with relatively ease. However, to then jump to I am not this mind is a much more difficult exercise, because now how am I not this mind? Then if I am not this mind, then who am I? As far as I'm concerned, all this stuff that goes on that puts me in the center of the universe is going on in my mind. So how am I not that? So the point that I'm trying to make here in relation to your doubts in your beginning is that it is certainly difficult for us to let go of the notion that we are the body. It is certainly much more difficult for us to let go of the notion that I am not this mind. And all the thoughts, the intelligence, the community we belong to, they all culminate into the mind. And for us to embrace something new, if it is something like Krishna consciousness, a new tradition, it necessarily means that we have to let go of our minds. We have to let go of what it is we thought was right in the past, whether it was another theological system, a group of friends who still practice or they act in a way that we no longer do, let's say. And you have to reject all of that. And it is very threatening. It is a difficult thing to do, very difficult, because if I'm not the body, then at least I'm the mind. But if I have to let go of everything that my mind has been telling me I am, I have to now be detached from my mind. I have to be willing to let go of everything I thought was right and embrace something completely new. But it is possible because, like you also mentioned, if I am able to observe my thoughts, that means I am not it. I'm not my thoughts. So we can do that experiments as well, realize we are not the minds, and therefore be more receptive to questioning even the contents of our mind. And that if another bona fide path presents itself, why not consider it? And Prabhupada calls Krishna consciousness, well, one of the ways in which Prabhupada would refer to Krishna consciousness is that this is the science of self-realization. So in terms of being a science, there has to be a hypothesis that is verifiable. And philosophically, we can do that, even in the topic that we were discussing earlier about the fundamental nature of the soul. Is it bad or is it good? Well, if philosophically speaking, if everything comes from God, that's my premise number one, everything comes from God. Premise number two is that God is all good. If God is all good and we came from God, then we must be all good as well. And what makes us act in a non-all good way is ignorance, but not the fundamental nature of who we are. Because everything comes from God, God is all good, therefore we are all good as well. It does not require any kind of fanaticism, dogmatic blind faith for you to detach yourself from your mind and any of belief thought systems that you had before and embrace something new, especially if you're able to apply reasonable logic and arrive at these conclusions. So I think we can make use of reason and logic. That's what separates us from animals. We can make use of reason and logic and scrutinize. We love to be scrutinized, right? Our teachers are always saying, we love to be scrutinized. We love to be subject to argumentation. So let's talk about it. And if it is reason, if it stands to reason, if it stands to logic, why not accept it? You know, you being in the greatest benefit for ourselves.
Thank you. I don't want to jump in again, but I will. Thank you. Just because I think this is, two things jumped or came to mind from what you just explained. And I think this is the greatest opportunity to just talk about them. Otherwise, it's easier to move on to other topics that are also very important. But one of the things I thought of was, okay, well, as a new practitioner, it would be quite scary if I heard that what you said, I'm not my mind, I'm not my thoughts, but everything is linked to that false ego, right? That false identity. And is the fear of, well, if I peel away all these things, what am I going to be left with? At least I know that if nothing else, I'm a woman and I'm from Colombia and I have a husband and I have a family that really loves me, and everything else can kind of change, but at least I have that. And so something I thought about, which really helped me let go of those things that were not really a part of who I really am, was the knowledge that it's not just that I'm giving something up and then I'm left with nothing. I'm actually just injecting Krishna and Krishna consciousness, right? When we say Krishna, it's like everything that comes with this self-realization package. So I'm inserting Krishna practices, a community, meditation, vegetarianism, self-work, and all that stuff, while still having my regular life, right? But little by little, I'm developing a higher taste for those things that actually have been proven to like be a direct connection with who I am as a soul. And so naturally I'll let go of the things that are not very important or that matter less or that are just more on a material platform. So it's not that starting a spiritual life is completely separating and letting go of things, even our friends, family situations, jobs, for a belief that you don't even know if it's true or not, and taking that leap of faith. It's just that we're encouraged to keep doing what you're doing. You don't have to change anything. But like you said, is it a plausible hypothesis? Is it something that it sounds to be like it's interesting enough to try out? And if it is, then you step into the lab and you try it out and you start incorporating these new habits. And then little by little, you see that difference and you naturally let go, and then you continue to thrive and move forward. So yeah, I wanted to bring up this point because I think a lot of people shut down at the sound, or when they first hear, oh, you have to give up. It's like, no, you don't have to give up anything initially, but as you practice, you will naturally let go of the things that are no longer serving a purpose in your spiritual practice. And so we can all agree, I think, that it's a gradual process, but yeah, it will necessitate some change, just like we're seeing that Arjuna has his mind set, and through logic and also through faith and trust, not fully because we're not in the 18th chapter yet, right? But just starting out, he at least believes that Krishna is his good friend and he can give him some guidance. So that's enough for Arjuna to be like, okay, I told you all my hangups. I'm going to sit down and like kind of give up, but not really, because I'm still open, and I'll let you just like do some surgery. And I think in the same way, if we want to make progress in spiritual life, we have to be open to change and not ready to let it go. That's okay, but at least come to the table honestly and ready to hear from somebody that can actually lead us forward. And so that was the first point I wanted to make. And then the other point that is more of a question, a problem I'm going to pose, is you mentioned that we all come from God, therefore it's logical to deduce that we are, and God is all good, therefore we're all good. And so, you know, does evil also come from God? If everything comes from God, then bad things also come from God. But furthermore, are you saying that a rapist, that a child molester, that the worst thing you can think of are also pure? Is that what this tradition is posing? And if it's logical for me, wouldn't that be also logical for somebody else? So how would we explain that? Like, yeah, that person is also pure.
Yes, we are absolutely 100% postulating that such a rapist, murderess, is ultimately a pure spiritual soul. In fact, Krishna would say himself that even if one has committed the most abominable of all acts, but is now situated in truth, meaning following a bona fide spiritual practice and redeeming themselves from all the bad actions and so on, if the person is now doing that, that person is to be considered saintly. That's Krishna's word. So yes, inherently we are all good, even that rapist. So that's the answer to that question, because Krishna said so too. Now, where does evil come from? That's the other question, the other problem you posed. It comes from our ignorance. We have free will. We have a undeniable free will. You are free to think however you want. Nobody can make you think in any way that you don't want to think, and your actions are going to spring forward from your thoughts. And you can start shaping your actions by shaping your thoughts. And at the level of your mind, you can think however you want. You have absolute free will there. And the actions that one may take that are less than ideal is also based on their free will. And a lot of them are very ignorant. You make a choice to commit an immoral act. You live with those consequences of such act due to karma. And that act may sprout into something quite malevolent and quite evil. And the evil is done by us, human beings, spirit souls trapped and confused in bodies and suffering from hate, from ignorance, greed, lust, etc. These are the sources of evil, and that are made by human beings. So evil comes from us, from our misuse of our free will. Now, one may ask, well, then free will, it's a pretty bad thing. So why do I have free will? Is the genesis of evil then? Because it is through free will only that we have even the opportunity to act in a bad way. So how to solve that problem? Well, free will is necessary. Free will is necessary in order for us to have pure love. What does that mean? It means that Krishna is the ultimate expert lover. And he knows that in order for us to truly experience the best version of love for him, it has to be the version of love that we choose to participate in. And therefore, free will is necessary. So Krishna will not take our free will away for that reason, because we must use our free will in order to choose to love him. That is the best possible version of our loving relationship with him. Therefore, free will exists, and it is something that Krishna will never compromise. He'll never take it away from us. But the flip side of that free will that we all have is that we can misuse it. We discussed in the previous podcast how tiny and infinitesimal we are, and how much, therefore, we can be bewildered by this gigantic material cosmic manifestation that we find ourselves in. And lust, hate, and anger comes from you. It comes from our misuse of our own free will. Evil, that rapist you mentioned, came from his ignorance, but not the soul. The soul, like Krishna would say, even if one commits the most abominable of all actions, that person, if now situated in truth, it should be considered saintly, because that's who we are. Does that answer your question fully, or just more or less?
It does. Thank you so much. And I think more than anything, it really points to the fact that Krishna is saying that this, through that verse that you mentioned, that this practice, the science of self-realization, is actually perfect. So it doesn't matter if we come with all of our hangups or none, but that's not the case, because we're in this material world. We have to come with some baggage. So it doesn't matter where we're at, as long as we start our spiritual practice, which means really that we are opening that door through free will to be receptive, then eventually through this practice of this science, we will achieve perfection, which means that we will be able to peel back all these layers of ignorance that you mentioned. And it's really actually very encouraging. It really, more than being encouraging, I think it really highlights the nature of God. Like, he's just so wonderful and like so nice. It's like I wouldn't want to send to hell somebody for eternity because they made a mistake. So I'm definitely not more moral than God, I hope, you know. And so it really points to that point that doesn't matter how much we mess up, it doesn't matter where we're at, as long as we can start and we want to start, which is God respecting our free will, then we can. And it's like, how amazing is that? We have everything we need to actually make it. We just have to want to do it. And so it really, that's something that really went deep for me. It's like, oh, this tradition actually works. And actually Krishna has this much faith in everybody, in all of us. It's like, hey, you're perfect, but you forgot. And so just get back on track, and then this process will take care of it. You will remember who you are if you stick to it strictly. And so I appreciated that. And yeah, it's actually really difficult to hear that I'm responsible for the bad things that happen, that my actions and my lack of knowledge lead me to making ignorant decisions that will then result in consequences that kind of make me more entangled in this material world, that makes me think more of what I'm not. But not only that, but I'm also influencing so many other people around me by my ignorance. And so it's hard to hear that. And at the same time, it's like, yeah, that's a good challenge. Like, I want to know that I'm actually that powerful, that I can make a change, that I'm not just like completely helpless, and that I could just blame other people for everything, although that is something that feels good, right? to blame others and think that you're just an innocent victim. Another side of me also feels like, yeah, I do have actually a lot of power and responsibility to get trained and to sign up for this process, because it's the only way that I could actually not only be happy, but the only way that I can actually help other people see things for what they are. So I appreciated your answer. Thank you so much. It was very complete.
Thank you.
Sorry, Kim.
Yeah. No. Don't apologize ever. Our tradition is very logical, which appeals to my overactive left brain. I remember when Tukaram first explained about the logic of consciousness, or the logic, which we've touched on today, the logic of an all-good God. Like you just said, Rangi, you know, would any of us ever condemn anyone to hell for eternity for thinking the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing? An all-good God is so forgiving. And so I really appreciate and have appreciated how this tradition, this community encourages everyone to think logically, like, yeah, put us through our paces, put this philosophy through its paces, and here's what you need to bring to the table to be receptive, you know, humility and raw honesty, and just association becomes so valuable when you see these people who talk the talk and walk the walk, the lifestyles. Tukram had mentioned things about being a devotee, Varangi, that you wanted to point out from last night's lecture.
Yeah, how are we doing on time? Are we good?
We're starting to wrap it up now.
I mean,
we always tend to we're getting a little bit longer each episode, but that's fine. Like
I know, right? So. Well, if it's okay with you guys, I mean, I think this is such an important point that I wouldn't want to just rush through it. I think it's something we can cover on our next episode. But yeah, I guess on verse 14, which is the one right after the evidence verse, where Krishna explains the nature of consciousness and the soul. Krishna describes the nature of a transcendentalist. He says the non-permanent appearance of happiness and distress and their disappearance in due course are like the appearance and disappearance of winter and summer seasons. They arise from sense perception, and one must learn to tolerate them without being disturbed. And so I guess that one also links to the next verse, which is 15. The person who is not disturbed by happiness and distress and is steady in both is certainly eligible for liberation. And so here Krishna is describing, like, this is what we need to strive for. Stoicism, which is what Tukram brought up last night. No matter what happens, no matter what comes our way, somebody that has started to grow some roots in their spiritual practice, and what's to speak of those that have really focused on developing that for a lot of years. They develop tolerance for the ups and downs in life. And it's not that bad things don't happen to transcendentalists or devotees or spiritualists. Life still happens, right? But the way that they react to those things is really what makes the difference, is the mentality, and how a transcendentalist, a spiritualist, a devotee actually sees divinity in everything around him. So he's always seen an opportunity of how he or she can get closer to deeper cultivating that love for God, which that person holds as the biggest treasure, the biggest wealth that they have. And so, yeah, the result for somebody like that is that they get liberation. And as we know, and as you know, in our tradition, liberation is not something that we strive for, or it's not something that we want to ask for, especially not from God. And it's for a devotee, what we're really after is Krishna, being able to attain love in its absolute form, through an adulterated and, I guess, unalloyed devotion with the Supreme. And so we see here, and this is something that Tukram was explaining last night, that I totally missed that point, but I heard it in a different way. He was explaining how for a devotee, it's like a python, a serpent. You know, when it's got a hold of its prey, it starts coiling up, and then little by little gradually starts contracting until the prey can no longer breathe or move, and in this way the python takes its life. I guess in this example of a devotee's life, it is remarkable because they're not swayed, they're not moved or bewildered by the changes, by the ups and downs. They don't doubt the fact that they're spiritual beings and that the goal of their life is to reconnect with their source and their beloved. And what he was explaining was that life, I guess Krishna in this conversation of life with his devotee, will test us, will test his devotee. Okay, you want liberation? Do you want the shiny thing? Do you want a perfect life with your family members, a great job, great salary, all these other things? But a transcendentalist will always realize that those things actually don't matter that much. And all they want is to get closer to God or to divinity. And so that person starts honing down and really getting rid of all these other distractions that are no longer, that are actually starting to get in the way. And I guess this also connects to the point that we were talking about before. It's something that happens through practice and gradually. As we go through life and as we grow bigger roots in our spiritual practice, we're able to use our mind and our intelligence to know what's helpful and what's not. So it's not that discrimination becomes non-existent. Now we can use discrimination, we can use our mind in the proper way. So a spiritualist actually learns how to use everything in life as an opportunity to grow closer to God. And so, like I said, I think there's so much more that could be said. And even just in class last night, this example, I interpreted in a different way than he intended it to be, which was also an accurate way of interpreting it. But yeah, this is the nature of spiritual topics. We can think and talk about them for a long time and really see how we can apply them in our lives and see the value in that. And so for me personally, that example hit hard because I realized that a lot of times I don't realize that this is an opportunity to get closer to who I am, and therefore get closer to my relationship with Krishna. But instead I get confused, and we start asking the wrong questions. Why is this happening to me? What did I do? I'm so good. Why would God want these things to happen to us? You know? And so instead of asking the right questions, what is this going to teach me? What do I need to learn from this? How can I use this in service? How can I use this to increase my attachment for hearing and chanting and associating more? And so we see that the same things happen to everybody, but the difference is made when a devotee has a different mentality and is able to respond instead of reacting, right? Respond in a different way, in a more conscious way. And therefore he and she can have a better life, a life that's rooted in more of an eternal happiness, as opposed to always being dependent on externals for steadiness and feeling satisfaction, which is something that he also brought up. It's like, why would you want to give away the key to your happiness to somebody else or the externals? And so that was good for me to hear. And so, yeah, I wanted to bring up those beautiful qualities of a devotee, of a transcendental we see in Arjuna, and that we should want to also develop lives and qualified to receive this knowledge and I guess mercy, if we want to go with that term.
I think your video hung up there just for a second. Okay, you're back. All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, though I resonated strongly with especially the points about giving others the key to your happiness as well. So I thought it was poignant and very moving how he explained how devotees react to the material world and stresses and so forth. So we are at the end of this week's episode. So do you have any closing thoughts, either of you? Tadeo, we want to start with you.
Sure. I will do a quick summary of the texts that we covered in class. And I'll close with that. So, and the reason why I want to do that is because there's a nice flow here that Tukaram also brought up in class. And I think there's value in listening to these texts from the psychology that Arjuna must have had in that conversation with Krishna and what Krishna was doing. So starting on verse 11 through then 14, I was stopping 14. So essentially Krishna tells Arjuna that, hey, you were speaking as if you were a learned man, but actually you were Griffin was not worthy. Essentially, you're talking nicely, but you don't know really what you're talking about. Then he says, hey, actually we're all eternal, because there's never a time that we didn't exist. There's never a time that we shall cease to exist. And you want to prove of that? Yes. Okay. So, you know, the soul is passing from youth to old age in the body. So similarly at death, it will pass on to another body. And then now is okay. So I'm not a body, I'm the soul, I'm eternal, but I am here. I'm actually, in Arjuna's case, I am in a battlefield. So how must I act? What does that mean to us who are not in the battlefield? How must I act, having realized that I am not a body, that I am an eternal spiritual soul? And that's how this verse number 14 comes into place, right? Well, we can act by realizing that we're not in control of things and tolerating them, such as the appearance and disappearance of summer and winter seasons. So as spiritualists, like Varangi was talking, like we were discussing here, we learn how to tolerate these things because we know we don't belong here. We are not these bodies. We are not this mind. We are eternal spiritual souls. And the summer will come and I'm happy. And then winter will come and I'm sad. Well, like, I guess the terminology you guys used is quite descriptive. Why would I handle the keys to my happiness to something that is outside of my control? So yeah, when you realize that you are an eternal spiritual being, but you're still faced with issues that come about in the world, what is it that Krishna expects us to do? Well, he expects us to tolerate them. And it's very reasonable to have that expectation because they are non-permanent. Both your happiness and your distress, they will come and certainly they will go. And if we get so hung up on a momentary thing, it can lead us to hate and anger, and that's where evil comes from. But something as bad as losing your job or losing a loved one, it will be terrible for a period of time. But in time, maybe if you lost a job, maybe it's a few months, maybe if you lost a loved one, maybe it's a few years. But you will come out of that. We have had experience of that. There are billions of people in the world that have had that experience. And again, that's what happens. In time, that suffering, that distress goes away. Similarly, the sense of accomplishments of a degree or a wedding or a new house or whatever it may be that brings us happiness, a trip to Hawaii, that will end. So if you get so elated when you're experiencing that happy thing, then what happens to you when the happy thing ends? Do you then get depressed and all bent out of shape? So yes, to be a spiritualist, having realized that we are eternal spiritual souls, but still in the world having experiences of up and down, we should tolerate them, knowing very well that they are all impermanent, they come and they go, and we should not lose sight of our main goal, which is to give back to our eternal pure nature, from which we can experience something much higher, love, pure love of Krishna. So these things of the world should not bewilder us, and one should learn how to tolerate them. So yes, that's my closing remark.
Thank you, Tadeo. That's really wonderfully said. Varangi, did you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, I just wanted to thank you both. This was a great conversation. I think we touched on a lot of very important points that, you know, are taboo or that are really scary at the beginning. And I feel so grateful to be a part of a community and a tradition where we are encouraging others to ask questions and to come with doubts, just like we did when we started this journey, and our teachers have systematically answered them, and now we're able to explain this to other people and talk about them. And honestly, just it really puts into perspective what a good life looks like. You know, what's the best way to live a life? If it's not for self-realization, then what's our life good for? And this is something that Tukaram really left us with last night, making that radical statement of, if it's not for self-realization, then it doesn't really matter. And that's another difficult pill to swallow, right? But it really puts things into perspective. So I'm really happy and grateful for this time, and to all the people that will be listening to our talks. And we really encourage you all to ask questions, to submit your questions. Hopefully eventually we're going to be having this live and to have interaction and really realize that spiritual life is alive. And this is actually something that Tukram opened with last night, saying that the Gita, or this conversation, isn't just something dead. It's dead to people that are not really seeking to learn, or I guess are not receptive. But it really requires one to properly hear. And I think that was a really good thing for me to hear. Was like, I could read these pages, I could read these verses on my own. If I'm not really open to it, I'm not really going to get much. But if we're open and we're willing to do the work and willing to hear from people that have realized these text scripture, then we're going to get way more than we could ever do on our own. So yeah, I guess I just want to encourage everybody saying that think play around with, that we could implement and with and let it deep and take root. And then that we can't really do that alone. It's like a perfect example of how by hearing about it and studying it and then coming together and talking about it it's such a nice way to understand this super heavy and thick philosophy in so many different ways, but how even this that was spoken 5,000 years ago is so relatable and so relevant even today. And so it really transcends time and space and trends and anything else, right? And so yeah, I'm feeling really grateful for this opportunity, and I really look forward to diving deep into the rest of this text with you, both of you. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, there's a little longer episode, but it's so much really good stuff to talk about. Really, yeah, deep concept. So thank you to everyone who's listening and watching, and we'll post links to the lecture that we're talking about. And every Friday night, you can join the Gita class in person or online. We're not in person right now, but online. And yeah, thank you. And we will see you again next week. So, Hare Bol.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you for joining us on Simple Living, High Thinking. Please subscribe as new episodes post every Monday. You can tune into this podcast live every Saturday at 3 p.m. Pacific Time. Check out our website for more details at simplelivinghighThinking.net. And if you would like to nominate someone for a devotee spotlight interview, contact us via our website at simplelivinghighThinking.net.